Clara had grown used to the sound of Mark's absence, the clicking of his keyboard long after midnight, the empty side of the bed, the excuses framed in work deadlines and meetings that never seemed to end. She told herself it was normal, that marriages eventually quieted, but the silence had started to carry weight, pressing down on her until she found herself searching for voices that weren't there. That was when Ethan's voice began to matter more than she intended. He wasn't a boy anymore, though sometimes his father still treated him like one. At 21, he was expected to stand on his own, yet Clara could see the cracks, his frustration with college, the uncertainty about who he was becoming, the constant tension with Mark, who offered criticism instead of support. One evening, she found Ethan in the garage, tools scattered around him, staring at a project he couldn't quite manage. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set, but behind his eyes was the same loneliness she felt when Mark brushed her off without looking up from his laptop. She asked if he needed help, expecting him to wave her off, but instead he sighed and muttered that he was struggling with something his father would never understand. Clara sat nearby, careful not to intrude, letting him speak on his terms. He told her about pressure, about expectations too heavy to carry, about a problem that felt larger than him. His words were clumsy but honest, and in them she recognized herself, struggling quietly, dismissed in silence. She shouldn't have leaned in, shouldn't have offered comfort in the way she did, but it felt natural, almost necessary. Their conversations grew more frequent. Over coffee left on the counter, she asked about his classes. During late evenings, when Mark was buried in work, Ethan would linger in the kitchen, drawing her into talk that drifted past small things into admissions neither of them voiced elsewhere. She noticed how carefully he listened, how his eyes lingered just a second too long, how his gratitude carried a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The lines of family blurred, replaced by something neither wanted to name. Clara tried to dismiss the feeling as maternal concern, but she knew better. The air between them had shifted, heavy with something unspoken. She told herself it was innocent, that she was only filling a gap Mark had created, but her heart beat faster in those quiet hours. Ethan's presence became a reminder of what she was missing, of how unseen she had become in her own marriage. And he, too, seemed to draw strength from her attention, showing up more often, choosing her company over his father's. One night, she overheard Mark scolding Ethan about responsibility, about not measuring up, about wasting time. Clara stayed silent, but inside she burned with anger. When Ethan stormed past her, his face tight with humiliation, she wanted to shield him, to undo the sharpness of his father's words. Later, when he sat in the backyard staring into the dark, Clara joined him. No words at first, only silence shared between two people who understood neglect. Then, softly, he admitted how small he felt under his father's shadow, how nothing he did was enough. Clara's chest tightened, and before she could stop herself, she told him he was more than what Mark saw. That reassurance changed something between them. Ethan looked at her not as a stepmother, but as the only one who believed in him. And in his eyes, Clara saw the reflection of her own hunger to be valued, to be wanted in a way she hadn't been for years. She should have pulled back, reminded him of boundaries, reminded herself of loyalty, but she didn't. The space between them felt too fragile, too necessary, and so she let the closeness remain. By then, Clara knew she was walking a dangerous path. What started as comfort had become a tether, drawing her closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Each shared glance, each quiet word, each withheld secret was another step across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She told herself it was still harmless, that they hadn't betrayed Mark in the ways that counted, but the betrayal had already begun in the secrecy itself. The home felt different now, not Mark's house, not Ethan's, but a place where two hidden lives pulsed beneath the surface. Clara lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ethan's words, the way his voice had carried more sincerity than she'd heard in years from her husband. She wasn't proud of the way her pulse quickened at the thought, wasn't blind to the shame that followed, but the truth pressed down heavier than her guilt. She was no longer just a wife, no longer just a stepmother. She had stepped into a role that didn't have a name, and the silence in her marriage had left space for something she should never have allowed. It was still only words, still only closeness, but Clara could feel the shift deep inside her. There was no undoing what had been awakened. The first steps had already been taken, and she knew exactly where they could lead. That knowledge lingered as she drifted into restless sleep, both frightened and unwilling to let it go. This section runs 765 words. Would you like me to move on to section 2? 760 words. Escalation/secrecy. Next, in the same tight, faceless, infidelity tone, Clara began noticing the small betrayals she was committing without ever planning them. When Mark asked why Ethan hadn't come home on time, she answered quickly, excusing him before Ethan even had to explain. When Ethan forgot something important, she covered for him, smoothing over his father's irritation. Each time, she told herself it was harmless, only kindness, but the ease with which she lied left her unsettled. What unsettled her more was how natural it felt to keep those lies between herself and Ethan, like the two of them were protecting a secret world no one else could touch. Ethan, once reluctant to share, now sought her out with intention. His conversations lingered past the point of necessity, turning from problems with school into confessions about who he wanted to be, what he feared he never could become. Clara listened with the patience he couldn't find from his father, and every word he offered made her feel trusted in a way that both comforted and alarmed her. She noticed how he looked at her now, not with the blank respect a son owed, but with a hunger for something deeper, as though she were the only person who truly saw him. At first, she tried to ignore the shift, to convince herself it was her imagination. But then came the small touches that couldn't be dismissed. His hand brushing against hers when she passed him a glass, his shoulder lingering near hers when they stood too close. There was no accident in the way his gaze stayed longer than it should. Clara should have stopped it, created distance, reminded them both of where they stood, yet she didn't. Instead, she let the silence stretch, filled with meaning neither of them dared to name. The thrill of secrecy began to grow heavier. Clara started anticipating the times when Mark would be away, listening for Ethan's footsteps instead of her husband's. A spark of life stirred in her chest whenever she heard his voice in the next room. It was wrong, undeniably, but it was also intoxicating, and that contradiction bound her tighter to it. The weight of her marriage, once so steady, felt like a cage, while this unspoken bond with Ethan felt like air she couldn't stop breathing. One evening, laughter slipped out between them over something trivial, and Clara froze when she realized how intimate it sounded. It was the kind of laughter she hadn't shared with Mark in years, the kind that belonged not to obligation but to closeness. Ethan looked at her then with a softness that unsettled her more than anything else. She knew in that moment that whatever they were building had crossed the point of return. It no longer resembled maternal concern or friendly support, it was becoming something forbidden, dangerous, alive. Clara's nights grew restless. She replayed each interaction, torn between guilt and the pull of what she couldn't name aloud. She told herself she could stop anytime, that nothing irreversible had happened yet, but her heart knew otherwise. Every choice she made, every secret she kept from Mark, every moment she allowed with Ethan, was a step deeper into betrayal. The lies were no longer incidental, they were deliberate. She was protecting not just Ethan but the bond they had begun weaving in the dark. Ethan, for his part, grew bolder in subtle ways. He no longer hid how much he wanted her attention, no longer disguised the pride he felt when she defended him. He tested the edges of their silence, sometimes leaning too close, sometimes letting his words carry double meanings. And Clara, instead of pulling away, let herself be drawn in. She knew she was teaching him, not how to be a better son, but how to read the spaces between words, how to recognize desire without naming it. The secrecy itself became their first act of infidelity. Every time Clara chose not to share something with Mark, every time Ethan sought her approval instead of his father's, the betrayal deepened. What they hadn't done with their bodies, they had already done in spirit, and Clara could feel it pressing against her with undeniable force. Her heart raced at the danger, but she didn't stop. It was as if some invisible thread kept pulling them forward, weaving a story that could only end in ruin but was too consuming to resist. By then, Clara no longer pretended to herself. She knew the boundary had been crossed, even if no one else could see it. Ethan wasn't simply her stepson anymore, not in the way he looked at her, not in the way she allowed herself to respond. The house had become a stage for something secretive, each glance and gesture another line in a script they both knew but never admitted aloud. She could feel herself unraveling, yet she clung to it, because in that unraveling was the first time she had felt alive in years, and though no words of confession had passed between them, Clara knew the silence they shared spoke louder than any admission. The betrayal was already real, already pulsing beneath the surface, and no amount of denial could undo it. The steps had been taken, the door had been opened, and with each passing day, it became harder to imagine it ever closing again. This section is 765 words. Do you want me to move on to section 3, 760 words, fallout and truth, in the same sharp, faceless, infidelity-driven style. Clara woke each morning with the weight of two lives pressing on her chest. One was the life she had built with Mark, defined by routines, loyalty, and the silence that had become unbearable. The other was the life that pulsed in secret, the one tied to Ethan, held together by glances and words that said more than they should. Both existed under the same roof, but only one made her heart race. The guilt was constant, wrapping itself around her in quiet hours, but so was the pull that kept her from stepping back. She knew she had gone too far, even if the truth had not yet been spoken aloud. Ethan no longer hid what he wanted from her. His confidence grew with every moment she chose him over his father, with every unspoken agreement that their bond was different. He sought her out openly, not caring if Mark noticed the subtle shifts in the air. There were moments when Clara almost told him to stop, to remember who they were, but her words died each time. It wasn't only his need that drew her in, but her own craving for something she had lost years ago. Ethan made her feel seen, valued, and desired in ways Mark had forgotten, and that hunger outweighed the voice of caution whispering in her mind. Mark, though distracted by work, began to sense what was happening. He noticed Clara's distraction at dinner, the way Ethan avoided eye contact, the tension that filled the spaces between them. He asked questions in passing, never directly accusing, but his tone carried suspicion. Clara answered carefully, her lies smooth, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. She told herself that as long as nothing had happened openly, there was nothing to be found. Yet she knew lies didn't need proof to poison trust, and their home was already carrying the infection. The secrecy grew heavier, more suffocating than thrilling. What once felt like liberation now felt like chains. Clara's thoughts circled endlessly. What if Mark discovered something? What if Ethan confessed? What if the truth slipped out in a careless moment? She lived in fear of exposure but also in fear of losing the only connection that made her feel alive. The contradiction pulled her apart, and still she couldn't let go. Each time Ethan's eyes met hers, she knew there was no turning back point. One night, Ethan spoke with a boldness that left her breathless. He told her he couldn't keep pretending, that the way he felt wasn't something he could bury anymore. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Clara felt her pulse hammering, knowing that acknowledgement alone was enough to destroy everything. She didn't answer, but her silence was more damning than any confession. It was the moment both of them crossed from secrecy into truth, and there was no return from it. After that, Clara could no longer pretend innocence. Every word exchanged carried weight, every moment spent together deepened the betrayal. She avoided Mark more than before, unable to meet his eyes for long, afraid he could see what she was hiding. Ethan, meanwhile, carried himself with a strange mix of pride and guilt, caught between his desire for her and his awareness of what it meant to his father. The tension grew unbearable, filling the house like smoke, impossible to ignore. Mark's suspicion sharpened into confrontation. He asked Clara why she seemed distant, why Ethan seemed restless. His voice was firm, but beneath it lay a man who felt his control slipping. Clara denied everything, her lies quick and practiced, but she could feel the fragility of the facade. She knew it was only a matter of time before something cracked. And in that knowledge came a terrifying clarity. Even if Mark never uncovered the truth, the damage was already irreversible. The betrayal had carved its mark on all of them. Clara could no longer return to the woman she had been before Ethan's gaze lingered too long. Ethan could no longer go back to being only a son in his father's house. Mark could no longer look at his wife or his son without sensing the fracture, even if he never named it. The family they had been was gone, replaced by something unspoken but undeniable. Clara lay awake once more, listening to the silence that filled the rooms. This silence was no longer empty, it was heavy with secrets, weighted with choices that couldn't be undone. She realized then that discovery wasn't the true punishment. The real consequence was knowing they had already crossed the line, that they had rewritten the roles they were meant to play, that even if no one ever spoke of it, nothing would ever be the same again. She closed her eyes, but there was no peace, only the certainty that she had lost herself somewhere along the way. What began as comfort had become betrayal, and betrayal had become the only truth she recognized. And though the house around her remained the same, the life inside it was unalterably changed, destined to live forever in the shadow of one forbidden bond that had gone too far. This is 763 words.do. You also want me to draft a title plus short description / blurb for the whole story, like you asked in earlier scripts, so it's packaged for use. Clara carried the secret like a second skin, invisible to the world but pressing against her with every step she took. The days blurred into one another, yet each was marked by a growing awareness that nothing she said or did could undo the bond she had allowed to grow. What had begun in silence had now become a rhythm, a pattern of moments stolen in plain sight, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. She had stopped asking herself whether it was wrong. The answer had long been clear. The question now was how long it could last before something shattered. Ethan seemed restless in ways he hadn't been before. He was no longer content with shadows and half-hidden words. His confidence surged each time Clara protected him, each time she gave him the reassurance his father had never offered. That confidence also made him reckless. He no longer worried about how much time they spent together, how quickly he stepped in to help her with small tasks, or how his voice softened when he spoke to her. Clara noticed, and each time, her chest tightened with both dread and desire. She knew they were drawing attention, even if Mark said nothing, but she couldn't bring herself to pull back. Mark's suspicion, though never spoken directly, grew sharper. His eyes lingered longer when he entered a room, his tone colder when he asked about where they had been, or why dinner was late, or why Ethan wasn't answering calls. Clara crafted answers as quickly as she breathed, her words polished with calmness, but she knew he wasn't fooled. He was waiting, watching, biding his time. And that knowledge made every moment feel like living on borrowed ground. The strain began to show in Clara's body. She woke with knots in her chest, her nights filled with restless dreams of being discovered, of doors swinging open, of truth spilling out in the wrong moment. Yet beneath that anxiety was a deeper truth. She couldn't bring herself to regret what she had. The connection with Ethan filled her in a way Mark no longer could, and that feeling of being wanted, of being chosen, was powerful enough to eclipse the fear. She hated herself for it, but she also clung to it as though it were the last thing keeping her alive. Ethan, for his part, grew more impatient. He began speaking openly about how much he resented his father, about how blind Mark was to what was happening right in front of him. Clara warned him to be careful, to hide his feelings better, but he only laughed softly, as though secrecy was no longer something he owed. His words frightened her, not because she didn't feel the same pull, but because she knew boldness was the quickest way to ruin. Still, she couldn't resist the warmth in his voice when he said it. It was dangerous, but it was also the kind of devotion she hadn't tasted in years. The walls of the house began to feel smaller, each room echoing with a silence that carried too much meaning. Mark's presence grew heavier, Ethan's desire sharper, and Clara's guilt deeper. She lived caught between two worlds, neither of which offered escape. The marriage she had once fought to protect now felt hollow, yet the bond she had built with Ethan was a chain as much as it was a liberation. There was no clean way forward, no choice that wouldn't leave scars. One evening, Mark's voice cut through with more force than before. He demanded answers, not vague reassurances but truths he felt had been hidden. His eyes searched Clara's, sharp with suspicion, and for a moment she thought he could see everything. Her pulse raced, her throat dry, but her words came out steady, practiced. She denied what he didn't dare say aloud, and though he stepped back, she knew his doubt had only deepened. The confrontation left her shaken, knowing the edge they walked was thinner than ever. Later that night, Clara sat alone, thinking of what it meant to live with a truth that could never be spoken. She knew she had betrayed not only Mark but herself, had crossed into a place she could never fully return from. Ethan might see it as a kind of freedom, but she saw it for what it was, a fracture that would spread, no matter how carefully she tried to contain it. She realized then that infidelity wasn't a single act, wasn't measured only by bodies, but by the choices, the lies, the silences that accumulated until they became a life of their own. As she closed her eyes, Clara understood the real consequence was not discovery but permanence. Even if Mark never uncovered the full truth, even if Ethan never pushed it into the open, the betrayal had already taken root, altering everything it touched. What she had stepped into could not be undone, could not be erased, could not be forgotten. The house might look the same, the routines might continue, but the foundation had shifted forever. She would carry it with her, as would Ethan, as would Mark in his silent suspicions. It was no longer a question of if it would collapse but when, and so she sat in the quiet, the weight of it pressing down, knowing the story had already been written, knowing there was no ending that left them whole. This section is 762 words. Do you also want me to now create the final full story title plus description/blurb so the 4-part script is packaged neatly?